silent threat is getting more and more attention. Declining birth rates and an aging population. These two go hand in hand. Every year, fewer children are born while more people leave the workforce and retire. Over time, this becomes a bigger and bigger problem, not only because pension systems are slowly collapsing, but also because entire economies and our global system, which is built on growth, start to struggle. And since falling birth rates are not just a Central European problem, but a global one, the consequences can affect us all, even our investment portfolios. If there are fewer workers and fewer consumers, how are companies and their stocks supposed to grow? How will governments pay back their debts when fewer people are paying taxes? And is this something we can even fix? Welcome to my Monaco Invest channel, and in today's video we will take a look at the demographic crisis from an investor's perspective. Europe is aging. Headlines often warn of the lowest numbers of births since World War II. Across the European Union, the average fertility rate is around 1.5 children per woman. But to simply maintain the population, the rate needs to be about 2.1. In many countries, this number was last reached in the 1970s or 1980s, often thanks to government incentives and pro-natalist policies. Even back then, the trend was clear: fertility tends to drop below the replacement level. And this is not just a European issue, it's global. Birth rates are falling in most countries worldwide. The annual global population growth rate has been steadily declining, now standing at about 0.85%. With more than 8 billion people, that's still a large absolute number, but the trend is downward. Yes, some countries still have very high fertility rates. For example, Chad averaged nearly 6 children per woman, but even their numbers are falling. Just 10 years ago, it was nearly one child higher. The same pattern holds in other countries with the highest fertility, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa. Yet, even in North Africa, fertility has dropped significantly. Algeria and Egypt are at about 2.7, and Morocco is close to falling below the 2.1 replacement level. In short, birth rates are declining almost everywhere. Whether you live in a rural African village or in a modern apartment in Western Europe, people are choosing to have fewer children. In Africa, this trend is partly explained by falling infant and maternal mortality. Families no longer need to have 7 children to raise 3 to adulthood. But in developed countries, the reasons are different. Housing costs, job insecurity, lifestyle changes, shifting priorities. That's why governments around the world are now asking, why are our citizens having fewer children? Unfortunately, there is no simple answer. The most obvious question to ask is, why don't people have children? And for decades, the answer has been remarkably consistent. Financial insecurity, unaffordable housing, prioritizing careers and income, postponing parenthood, and the desire to enjoy youth. These are by far the most common spontaneous responses, and surveys around the world show very similar results. A common counter-argument is, but we live better than ever before. And if you compare the life of an average person today to that of 50 years ago, in many ways that's true. Of course, there are exceptions. For example, low-income families in the United States whose economic situation may actually be worse now. But overall, declining birth rates are a global trend, not explained away by simple notions of prosperity. This is usually where the discussion ends or shifts to other reasons: lack of suitable partners, lack of childcare, careerism, and sometimes it drifts into more unusual territory. I won't have children because of climate change or because there is a war in Ukraine. If our great-grandparents had thought the same way during World War II, many of us simply wouldn't be here today. The truth is that most of these reasons can be challenged. Today is historically one of the easiest times to start a family. Strong welfare states won't let you starve. Medicine and healthcare are widely available. Science and technology continue to progress. Unemployment is low, opportunities for entrepreneurship exist, and many jobs can even be done from home. These are real advantages that past generation didn't have. But here is the catch. Even in the past, wealthier families often had only two children despite being able to afford more. The sharpest drop in birth rates occurs among the lower middle class and the poor, and that's where things really aren't so rosy, which is why so many people cite their economic situation as the main reason for not having children. In Europe, the picture is shaped by post war developments and different political regimes, but if you looked at classic capitalist success stories like the United States or South Korea, you see a similar pattern. These countries long symbolized economic success and the winning model. Ask most people what the American dream means, and they will say get a job, buy a house, start a family, own a car, go on a holiday. And for much of the 20th century, almost anyone who worked hard, whether as a construction worker or a shop clerk, could realistically achieve that. Popular culture reflected this too. Think of sitcoms from the 1980s where the main character was a struggling salesman but still had a house, a car, a stay at home wife, and two kids. He was considered poor only because his neighbors, lawyers, or doctors drove nicer cars and vacationed in Bora Bora. But ask a shoe salesman today if he owns a house, a car, and supports a family. The answer will be very different, and not just in America, but across Europe as well. It's a simplified example, but browse through today's articles and discussions, and you'll see the same conclusion. For many, the American dream is dead, and the same disillusionment is spreading in other developed nations too. So, where am I going with all of this? The point is that declining birth rates are an extremely difficult problem to solve. It would require nothing less than a fundamental shift in how society thinks and a completely different way of raising future generations. Yes, there are countries where fertility has increased. One example often cited is Uzbekistan, where the fertility rate rose from 2.44 children per woman in 2005 to 3.45 in 2025. Many studies highlight improvements in living standards, greater social security, and a more positive outlook for the future, even reflected in national pride, such as Uzbekistan's first ever qualification for the FIFA World Cup. But the other side of this success is cultural. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Uzbekistan has been increasingly influenced by Islamic traditions and traditional gender roles. Combined with economic growth and family policies that made it less necessary for women to enter workforce, the result was higher birth rates. This shows that financial incentives alone cannot solve the problem without deeper societal changes. And such changes cannot realistically happen within just one or two political terms. This means the problem will continue to grow globally. But how big of a problem is it really for us as investors? According to projections, global fertility will only fall below the 2.1 replacement rate after 2050. The first actual decline in the world population is not expected until around 2090. By then, the planet will still have more than 2 billion more people than today. Even the most pessimistic forecasts show several more decades of growth. So, if you are a young investor in your 20s, the biggest challenges linked to falling birth rates will likely not directly impact your portfolio. Companies will continue to operate, people will still spend money, and the global population will keep rising for decades. A globally diversified portfolio should be safe from the risk. However, in some countries with very low fertility today, the problems are already visible. unsustainable pension systems, labor shortages in healthcare and social services, and a general lack of workers. These countries can be seen as pioneers of the demographic future that awaits others. The first major issue already seen in the US, Western Europe, South Korea, and Japan is the shortage of labor. This happens even before populations shrink. As large generations grow old, they spend less and need more care, leaving companies without enough workers. The typical solution is migration, managed well and in a controlled way. It works, but when overdone, it can cause social tensions, not just due to cultural differences, but because companies may exploit cheaper foreign labor, preventing wages from rising in some sectors. From a shareholder's perspective, lower labor costs may look good in the short run, but in the long term, it's not sustainable. And since the global population itself will eventually start to decline, migration alone won't solve the problem, unless, of course, we discover islands by then. All of this creates pressure for automation and robotics. These technologies already exist, financing is available, and companies are interested. It's very likely that many tasks in the future will require far less direct human labor, as robots and artificial intelligence will be able to perform them just as well. For investors, this is a long term opportunity, but only if you invest wisely or keep the tech sector as a part of a broader portfolio. At the same time, the labor shortage we keep hearing about may not be as severe as it seems. A large share of today's employment is frankly artificial. Many jobs could disappear overnight without any noticeable impact on society or the state. The real question is how many of these so called bullshit jobs are there? If you work in a big company, ask yourself, is every one of my colleagues or managers truly essential? And even more, does my job actually matter or could it already be replaced by a simpler process? In the UK, 37% of employees said their jobs were completely pointless, adding no tangible value. Combine that with advances in AI and robotics, and shareholders don't need to worry that companies will run out of workers for essential tasks. The aging population also creates two major investment opportunities: healthcare and social services. But beware of thematic ETF labeled aging population. Often these funds contain assets that don't actually fit the theme, such as an overweight in biotech or even finance. Always look beyond the name to the index methodology and the actual holdings. Other population also tend to spend less and consume less, which means fewer customers for businesses. On a global scale, this won't be a major issue for our investment generation, but in some countries, especially in Europe, it could show up within our lifetimes. Another fact: older people pay far less in taxes, sometimes not at all. Meanwhile, government spending and debt keep rising. The result? Higher wealth taxes are very likely in the future. For younger investors in their 20s or 30s, this means you should plan conservatively, assume a possible 10 up to 20% tax on portfolio withdrawals decades from now. It's nothing catastrophic, but it's wise to invest a bit more each month than originally planned. Some argue that more retirees withdrawing from their portfolios could push risky assets like stocks down, but that's based on outdated and overly conservative models where retirees sold large chunks of their holdings. Modern strategies, whether it's the 4% rule, dividend investing, or diversified asset mixes, don't require such drastic selling. And let's not forget, most of the world's population doesn't invest yet. You probably already do, and since declining birth rates and aging will first put pressure on pension systems in wealthy countries, one of the only viable solutions being discussed is long-term regular investing, But once the majority of people start investing for retirement, it's almost certain that governments will eventually want to take a slice through new taxes. Declining birth rates in the long run will largely solve themselves. Most of us won't live to see the actual decline of the global population, and many of the initial challenges will likely be addressed by technological progress and changes in tax systems. At the same time, the situation creates clear investment opportunities in certain sectors, automation, robotics, and healthcare being the most obvious. Just be careful when choosing thematic ETFs. Make sure you are not buying into holdings that have little to do with the actual theme. The biggest issue that will directly affect our lives is the growing pressure on traditional pay as you go pension systems, and that's a major political topic not only in Europe but worldwide. In one of my next videos, we'll take a closer look at these pension challenges and the possible solutions. If you don't want to miss it, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell. I'd also really appreciate your feedback. Take care and see you next time.
Bye.